The email arrived at 3:47 a.m., time-stamped like a confession in the dark. I was awake, as I had been for most nights that year, staring at the ceiling of my San Francisco apartment, watching the city lights flicker through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Bay Bridge. Sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford, not when the company I had built from nothing was being dismantled piece by the one person I had trusted above all others: my brother. The subject line was simple: launch announcement, Nexus AI. I opened it with fingers that had gone numb hours ago, my eyes burning, my chest tight. The email was a press release, formatted with the slick professionalism of a marketing team that had been working in secret for months. It announced the public launch of Nexus AI, a groundbreaking artificial intelligence platform that would revolutionize the way businesses interact with their customers. The CEO was listed as Marcus Chin, my brother. The technology described in breathless, hyperbolic prose was mine. Every line, every feature, every innovation, it was all lifted directly from the proprietary code I had been developing for 3 years in the basement of our parents' house, while Marcus sat upstairs watching television and telling me I was wasting my time. I read the email 3 times, each pass stripping away another layer of disbelief. The first time, I felt confusion. Perhaps it was a coincidence, a different company with similar ideas. The second time, I felt the cold creep of recognition. The algorithms, the architecture, the specific language used to describe the neural processing models, it was unmistakable. The third time, I felt nothing. Just a vast, hollow emptiness where my heart used to be. The same emptiness I had felt when my father told me, at 15, that I should focus on something practical instead of coding. The same emptiness I had felt when Marcus, at 22, had walked into our parents' living room and announced that he was going to be an entrepreneur, and they had applauded. The same emptiness I had felt every day of my life, watching my brother receive the love and validation that I had worked myself to the bone to earn. My name is Elena Chin. I am 32 years old, and I am the architect of one of the most sophisticated AI platforms ever developed. But no one knows that. Because my brother, Marcus, stole my code, presented it as his own, and has spent the last 8 months building a startup on the foundation of my life's work. He took my algorithms, my architecture, my years of sleepless nights and failed experiments and breakthroughs that came at 3 in the morning when the rest of the world was asleep. He took it all, and he called it his. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't call him, though my phone was in my hand and his number was in my contacts, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to demand an explanation, to hear him lie to my face, to give him the chance to prove that he was exactly the person I had always known him to be. Instead, I put the phone down. I walked to the window. I looked out at the city that had been my home for the last 6 years, the city where I had built a life away from my family, away from the constant comparison, away from the slow, steady erosion of my self-worth that had begun the day Marcus was born. I thought about the night I had told him about my work. It was a year ago, at our parents' house for Thanksgiving. I had been foolish enough to believe that time had changed things, that the golden child and the forgotten daughter could finally meet as equals. I had been drinking wine, relaxed for the first time in months, and I had talked about my project with an enthusiasm I hadn't allowed myself to show in years. I told him about the algorithms I had developed, the breakthroughs I had made, the investors who were beginning to show interest. I told him about the future I was building, the company I was planning to launch, the life I was finally going to claim as my own. He had listened with that easy charm of his, nodding at the right moments, asking the right questions. He had told me he was proud of me. He had said the words I had been waiting to hear my whole life. And then, the next morning, when I went to make coffee, he had copied my files from the laptop I had left open on the kitchen table. He had taken everything. And he had never looked back. I should have known. I should have seen it coming. Marcus had always taken what he wanted. When we were children, he took my toys, my clothes, my friends. When we were teenagers, he took the attention of our parents, the praise I earned, the recognition I deserved. When we were adults, he took the trust one had been foolish enough to give him. And now he was taking the one thing that was truly mine. The thing I had built with my own hands, my own mind, my own relentless, unforgiving determination. I sat down at my desk, the same desk where I had written the code that Marcus was now claiming as his own. I opened my laptop and began to search. I found the Nexus AI website, sleek and professional, with Marcus's face on the About page, smiling at the camera like a man who had never had a single doubt in his life. I found the investor deck, the press coverage, the launch event scheduled for 3 weeks from now at the Palace Hotel in downtown San Francisco. I found the list of investors who had already committed millions to the project. And I found the technology section, where the features of the platform were described in language that was painfully, intimately familiar. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark, the city lights flickering through my window, the weight of my brother's betrayal pressing down on me like a physical force. I could fight him. I could hire a lawyer, sue for intellectual property theft, drag him into court, and watch his startup crumble under the weight of the truth. I could expose him publicly, let the world know that Marcus Chin was a fraud, that the company he had built was built on stolen work, that the golden boy was nothing but a thief. But if I did that, I would be fighting his war. I would be reacting to his choices, letting his actions define my life, my career, my future. I would be the angry sister, the bitter daughter, the woman who couldn't let go. And Marcus, with his charm and his connections and his ability to make people believe whatever he wanted them to believe, would find a way to spin it. He would tell the world that I was jealous, that I was trying to take credit for work that wasn't mine, that the technology was his all along. He would smile that easy smile, and people would believe him. They always did. I needed another way. A way that didn't involve fighting his war. A way that let him build his empire, let him climb as high as he wanted to climb, let him believe that he had won. And then, when he was at the peak, when the world was watching, when the stakes were highest, I would let him fall. I opened my laptop again. I pulled up the files I had saved, the ones Marcus hadn't taken because he didn't know they existed. The backdoors. The fail-safes. The pieces of code that I had embedded in the architecture, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. Every programmer leaves signatures, hidden markers, proof of authorship that can't be erased. I had been coding since I was 12 years old. I knew how to leave traces that no one else could find. I spent the next hour documenting. I pulled up the original timestamps, the development logs, the versions of the code that dated back years. I pulled up the emails I had sent to myself, the notes I had taken, the proof that I had been working on this project long before Marcus had ever heard of it. I pulled up the conversations I had with early investors, the ones who had been interested in my work before Marcus swooped in and stole it. I built a file that contained the truth. The truth that Marcus had spent his life running from, the truth that my parents had spent their lives pretending didn't exist, the truth that I had spent my life trying to earn. When I was done, I closed the laptop and walked to the window. The sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking over the bay. I had been up all night, but I wasn't tired. I was something else. Something sharper. Something colder. Something that had been waiting for this moment my whole life. I picked up my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. Sarah Okonkwo. A tech journalist who had written about the AI industry for years, who had a reputation for being fair, thorough, and utterly relentless when she smelled a story. I had met her at a conference 2 years ago, before Marcus had stolen my work, before the world had even heard of Nexus AI. We had talked for hours about the future of artificial intelligence, about the ethics of the industry, about the stories that no one was telling. She had given me her card. She had told me to call if I ever had something worth sharing. I dialed her number. It was early, barely 6 in the morning, but she answered on the third ring. Her voice was rough, the voice of someone who had been up late and was already thinking about the next story. Elena Chin, she said. There was surprise in her voice, but also something else. Recognition. I was wondering when you'd call. I have a story, I said. The biggest story in tech. The one no one is telling. She was quiet for a moment. I could hear her waking up, her mind already processing, calculating, assembling the pieces of a story she hadn't yet heard. I'm listening, she said. I told her. Not everything. I wasn't going to give her the whole story over the phone, not yet. But enough. Enough to get her attention. Enough to make her understand that this was not just a story about a stolen algorithm or a family feud. This was a story about power and privilege, about the way the world rewards the people who already have everything and ignores the people who have nothing. This was a story about a brother who had spent his life taking what he wanted and a sister who had spent hers letting him. When I finished, Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Deeper. More serious. "How much proof do you have?" she asked. "Enough," I said. Timestamps. Development logs. Emails. Conversations with early investors. Everything I need to prove that the code was mine, that the work was mine, that Marcus stole it from me. She was quiet again. "Then, why are you coming to me now? Why not go to a lawyer? Why not sue him?" I looked out the window. The sun was rising now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the city below beginning to stir. Because a lawsuit would be his war, I said. His battlefield. His rules. He would hire the best lawyers, spin the story, make himself the victim. And even if I won, it would take years. Years of my life that I would never get back. I want something faster. Something cleaner. Something that lets the world see exactly who Marcus Chin is before he has a chance to cover it up. "And what do you want from me?" "I want you to write the story," I said. "Not yet. Not until the launch. I want him to go public. I want him to stand on that stage, in front of the investors, the press, the world, and claim my work as his own. I want him to build his empire, climb as high as he can climb, let everyone believe that he is the genius he has always pretended to be. And then, when he is at the peak, when the world is watching, I want you to tell the truth." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. I could hear her breathing, the slow, steady rhythm of a woman who is thinking, calculating, weighing the risks and rewards of the story I was offering her. "That's a dangerous game," she said finally. "If he finds out what you're planning, he could destroy the evidence. He could spin the story before we have a chance to tell it. He could ruin you." "He won't find out," I said. "He thinks I'm nothing. He's always thought I was nothing. He stole my work because he didn't think I would fight back. He built his company on my code because he didn't think I had the courage to stop him. He has no idea who I am. And that's exactly why he's going to fall." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. "I need you to trust me, Sarah. I need you to let me do this my way. And when the time comes, I need you to be ready." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different. It was the voice of a journalist who had found the story she had been waiting for her whole career. "I'm ready," she said. "Whenever you are." I hung up and sat in my office, the sun now fully risen, the city bright and alive below me. I had done what I set out to do. I had planted the seed. I had set the stage. And now all I had to do was wait. I thought about Marcus. About the brother who had taken everything from me, who had spent his life basking in the light that should have been mine, who had looked at me across the Thanksgiving table and told me he was proud of me while he was already planning to steal the one thing I had built for myself. I thought about the launch event, the stage he would stand on, the applause he would receive, the world that would believe he was a genius. I thought about the moment when it would all come crashing down. The moment when the truth would finally, after 32 years, be told. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. Somewhere out there, Marcus was waking up to the day of his greatest triumph. The launch was 3 weeks away. The investors were lining up. The press was buzzing. The world was waiting to meet the man who had revolutionized artificial intelligence. And I was the only one who knew that it was all a lie. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who had spent her life being invisible, being dismissed, being told that she was not enough. It was the smile of a woman who had finally, after 32 years, decided to be seen. Let him build his empire, I thought. Let him climb as high as he wants. Let him believe that he has won. And when he is at the peak, when the world is watching, when the stakes are highest, I will be there. And I will watch him fall. The 3 weeks between Sarah's call and the Nexus AI launch were the longest of my life. I watched from the shadows as my brother's star rose, each day bringing new headlines, new investors, new accolades for a man who had never written a line of code in his life. The tech press, which had ignored my work for years, was suddenly obsessed with Marcus Chin, the visionary who had single-handedly revolutionized artificial intelligence. He was profiled in Wired, interviewed on CNBC, featured in a glossy spread in Forbes that called him the new face of Silicon Valley innovation. I read every article, watched every interview, studied every photograph of my brother smiling at the camera like a man who had never had a single doubt about his place in the world. The coverage was infuriating in its predictability. Marcus was handsome, charismatic, effortlessly charming, the kind of person the media loves to anoint as a genius. He told stories about his late nights coding and his years of struggle before the breakthrough that changed everything. He spoke about the vision that had driven him, the passion that had sustained him, the belief that had carried him through the darkest moments. Not once did he mention me. Not once did he acknowledge that the code he was presenting as his own had been written by someone else, in a basement, while he slept. Not once did he show any sign that he remembered the sister who had given him everything and received nothing in return. I watched it all with a stillness that surprised even me. There was no rage, no tears, no desperate urge to call the reporters and tell them they had been fooled. There was just the cold, clear focus of a woman who had spent her life being underestimated and was finally, after 32 years, ready to prove them all wrong. I was not going to fight Marcus on his terms. I was going to let him build his empire, let him climb as high as he wanted, let him believe that he had won. And then, when the world was watching, I was going to show them exactly who he was. I spent those weeks preparing. Not frantically, not desperately, but with the methodical precision of a woman who had been planning this moment her whole life. I gathered my evidence, organizing it into a timeline that stretched back years. The original code, with timestamps that predated Marcus's involvement by 18 months. The emails I had sent to myself, documenting each breakthrough as it happened. The conversations with early investors recorded and transcribed, proving that I had been shopping this technology long before Nexus AI existed. The server logs, the development notes, the hundreds of pages of documentation that would prove, beyond any doubt, that the work was mine. I also prepared for what would come after. The launch would be the beginning, not the end. When the truth came out, Marcus would fight back. He would deny everything, claim that I was jealous, that I was trying to take credit for work that wasn't mine. He would hire lawyers, spin the story, make himself the victim. My parents would take his side, they always did. The investors would be furious, but they would also be desperate to salvage something from the wreckage. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, I would have to be ready. I called my lawyer, a woman named Diane Foster, who had represented me in a contract dispute years ago and had been quietly advising me ever since. She was sharp, relentless, and utterly without sentiment, exactly the kind of person I needed for what was coming. I told her everything. About the code, about the theft, about the evidence I had gathered. I told her about my plan, about letting Marcus launch, about exposing him at the height of his success. She listened without interrupting, her face impassive, her eyes sharp. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said finally. "If this goes wrong, it could destroy you. Not just your career, but your reputation. The tech industry is small. People talk. If Marcus can make you look like a jealous sister trying to tear down her brother's success, you'll never work in this town again." "I know," I said. "And you're willing to take that risk?" I looked at her, at this woman who had spent her career navigating the treacherous waters of Silicon Valley law, and I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't expected. Respect. "I've spent my whole life being invisible," I said. Being dismissed. Being told that I wasn't enough. I've watched my brother take everything that should have been mine, and I've let him. Not anymore. I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing it because the truth matters. Because my work matters. Because I matter. She nodded slowly. "Then, let's make sure you have everything you need to win." We spent the next 2 weeks building the case. Diane filed a provisional patent application in my name, establishing legal ownership of the core technology. She drafted cease and desist letters, ready to be sent the moment the story broke. She reached out to intellectual property experts who could testify to the uniqueness of my work, the impossibility of it being developed independently by someone with Marcus's background. She built a legal strategy that would leave Marcus with no room to maneuver, no way to claim that the work was his. While Diane worked on the legal front, I focused on the technical one. I went back through the code, line by line, identifying the unique signatures that proved it was mine. Every programmer leaves traces, and I was no exception. There were comments in the code, notes I had left for myself, references to inside jokes, and personal milestones that no one else would understand. There were stylistic choices, patterns of organization, ways of structuring algorithms that I had developed over years of trial and error. I documented it all, creating a map of my authorship that was as unique as a fingerprint. I also started building something new. Not a replacement for the technology Marcus had stolen, that was too far along, too deeply embedded in the Nexus AI platform to be easily replicated. Something different. Something better. I had spent 3 years developing the original code, but I had spent the last 8 months thinking about what I would do differently, how I would improve it, where I would take it next. Now, with the original code lost to me, I had the freedom to start fresh. To build something that was not just a copy of what Marcus had stolen, but an evolution. Something that would make his version look like a prototype, a first draft, a shadow of what it could have been. I worked at night, when the city was quiet and the only light came from the glow of my computer screen. I worked in the early mornings, before the demands of my consulting work consumed me. I worked on weekends, in coffee shops and libraries and the small studio apartment I had rented as a workspace. I worked with a focus that bordered on obsession, pouring everything I had into the new project. And slowly, almost without noticing, I began to heal. Not from the betrayal, that wound was still too fresh, too deep, but from the years of invisibility. The years of being the one who worked while others took credit. The years of being the sister who was never enough. The week before the launch, I received a call from my mother. I hadn't spoken to her since Thanksgiving, since the night Marcus had stolen my work while I slept. Her voice was bright, cheerful, the voice of a woman who had no idea that her children were at war. "Elena, I was just thinking about you. Marcus's big launch is next week. We're all so excited. Your father and I are flying out for it. We were hoping you'd come. It would mean so much to Marcus. To all of us." I sat in my office, the phone pressed to my ear, the city dark outside my window. I thought about all the times my mother had called me with news about Marcus. His graduation. His first job. His engagement, the one that had fallen apart when his fiancé realized who he really was. Each time, she had called with the same bright, cheerful voice, expecting me to be happy. For him, to celebrate his success, to pretend that I didn't notice the way she lit up when she talked about him and went quiet when she talked about me. "I don't think I can make it," I said. "I have work." Her voice tightened. "Work? Elena, this is your brother. This is the most important moment of his life. You can't miss it because of work." I closed my eyes. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to tell her what Marcus had done, what he was planning, what I was going to do to him. I wanted to tell her that the most important moment of his life was built on a lie, that the son she worshipped was a thief, that the daughter she had always dismissed was the one who had done the work. But I didn't. Not yet. That moment was coming, but it wasn't tonight. "I'll try," I said. "I can't promise anything." She sighed, the sound of a woman who had long since given up on her disappointing daughter. "Well, try. That's all I ask." She hung up before I could say anything else. I sat in the dark, the phone still warm in my hand, and I thought about the last time I had seen my mother. It was at the same Thanksgiving dinner where Marcus had stolen my work. She had spent the evening fussing over him, asking about his projects, his investments, his future. She had barely looked at me. When I tried to tell her about my work, she had waved her hand dismissively, the way she always did, and changed the subject back to Marcus. I had spent my whole life trying to earn her love. I had worked harder, achieved more, built things that she couldn't even imagine. And it had never been enough. It would never be enough. Because the problem wasn't me. The problem was her. The problem was a mother who had only enough love for one child, and that child was never going to be me. I put the phone down and walked to the window. The city was still there, still bright, still humming with the energy of a million lives being lived. Somewhere out there, Marcus was preparing for the biggest night of his life. Somewhere out there, my parents were packing their bags, getting ready to celebrate their son's success. Somewhere out there, the tech world was waiting to meet the man who had revolutionized artificial intelligence. And somewhere out there, Sarah Okonkwo was writing the story that would change everything. The day of the launch arrived, bright and clear, the kind of San Francisco day that made you forget that the city could be cold and gray. I woke early, earlier than I had in weeks, and I stood at my window watching the sun rise over the bay. I was nervous. Not about what was going to happen. That was out of my hands now, in the hands of Sarah and the evidence I had given her. I was nervous about what would come after. About the phone calls, the emails, the accusations. About the moment when I would have to look my parents in the eye and tell them that their son was a fraud. About the years of silence that would follow, the years of being the daughter who destroyed her brother's life. I dressed carefully, in a simple black dress that was professional but not flashy. I was not going to the launch as a guest. I was going as a witness. I wanted to see Marcus's face when he stepped onto that stage, when he looked out at the crowd of investors and journalists and admirers, when he claimed my work as his own one last time. I wanted to remember that moment, to hold it in my mind, to use it as fuel for what was coming. The Palace Hotel was a monument to old San Francisco wealth, all marble and chandeliers and gold leaf. I arrived early, before the crowds, and slipped into the back of the ballroom where the launch was being held. The room was already filling up, the tech elite of Silicon Valley mingling with investors and journalists, all of them buzzing with anticipation. I saw Sarah near the front, her laptop open, her eyes scanning the room. We didn't acknowledge each other. We didn't need to. We both knew what was coming. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. And then Marcus walked onto the stage. He looked exactly as I remembered him. Tall, handsome, effortlessly charming. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my rent, his hair perfectly styled, his smile wide and confident. He was the golden boy, the prodigal son, the genius who had come out of nowhere to change the world. And as he stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd of people who had come to worship him, I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt pity. Not for myself, not for the work he had stolen, but for him. For the emptiness inside him, the need to take what others had built, the hunger for approval that would never be filled. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. "My name is Marcus Chen, and I am here tonight to change the world." The crowd laughed. He smiled. And he began to speak. He told the story he had been telling for weeks. The story of the visionary who had worked for years in secret, who had sacrificed everything for his dream, who had finally, after years of struggle, achieved the breakthrough that would revolutionize artificial intelligence. He spoke with passion, with conviction, with the kind of charisma that made people want to believe. And I sat in the back of the room, watching him perform, and I waited. He showed the slides. The ones I had designed, the diagrams I had drawn, the architecture I had built. He explained the technology, the algorithms, the breakthroughs. He spoke about the future, the possibilities, the world that would be transformed by his work. And with each word, I felt the cold certainty of what I was about to do settle deeper into my bones. He was about to introduce the demo, the live demonstration that would show the world what his technology could do, when I saw Sarah stand up. She walked to the front of the room, her laptop open, her face set. Marcus saw her, hesitated, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the hushed room. "I have a question." Marcus smiled, recovering quickly. "Of course. We'll have a Q&A after the demo. This won't take long," Sarah said. She turned to the crowd. "My name is Sarah Okonkwo. I'm a technology journalist. And I've been investigating the origins of the technology that Mr. Chin is presenting tonight. The room went silent. Marcus's smile faltered. I don't think this is the appropriate time, Mr. Chin, Sarah said, her voice steady. Did you or did you not steal the code for your AI platform from your sister, Elena Chin? The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat, the blood pounding in my ears. Marcus stood at the podium, his face pale, his hands gripping the edges of the lectern. The crowd was staring, waiting, the energy of the room shifting from celebration to something else. Something darker. I don't know what you're talking about, Marcus said. His voice was tight, strained. Elena is my sister. I love her. But she has nothing to do with this company. Sarah turned to the screen behind him, where his slides were still displayed. She plugged her laptop into the projector, and the image changed. It was a document. My document. The timeline I had built, stretching back 3 years, showing the development of the code, the breakthroughs, the work that had been done long before Marcus ever claimed it as his own. This is a timeline of the code development, Sarah said. The timestamps are irrefutable. The code that Mr. Chin is presenting tonight was written by Elena Chin. It was developed over 3 years, in a basement in San Jose, while Mr. Chin was working as a marketing consultant for a tech firm in Los Angeles. She clicked to the next slide. A screenshot of an email, dated 2 years ago, from me to an early investor. This is an email from Ms. Chin discussing the technology with a potential investor. It predates the founding of Nexus AI by 18 months. Another click. Another slide. A photograph of me at my desk, the code visible on the screen behind me. The timestamp in the corner was unmistakable. Marcus was shaking his head, his face a mask of disbelief. This is a lie. She's lying. She's jealous of my success. She always has been. Sarah clicked to the final slide. A document, written in Marcus's own hand, confessing to the theft. I had found it in his apartment months ago when he had asked me to house sit while he was on vacation. He had written it in a journal, a rambling confession to himself, words he had never intended anyone else to see. I had photographed it and put it back, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. The room erupted. Voices raised, phones ringing, journalists scrambling to capture the story. Marcus stood at the podium, frozen, his face drained of color. He looked at the crowd, at the investors, at the journalists, at the people who had come to worship him and were now watching him fall. And then, for a moment, his eyes found mine. He saw me, sitting in the back of the room, watching him with the stillness of a woman who had waited her whole life for this moment. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I just looked at him, my brother, the man who had taken everything from me, and I let him see what I had become. Not the invisible sister. Not the disappointed daughter. The woman who had finally, after 32 years, claimed what was hers. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to lie. But there were no words left. The truth was out. And the world was watching. I stood up. I walked out of the ballroom, through the marble lobby, past the chandeliers and the gold leaf, out into the cool San Francisco night. The city was still there, still bright, still humming with the energy of a million lives being lived. But everything was different now. I was different. I walked to the edge of the sidewalk and looked up at the sky. The stars were out, faint against the city lights, but they were there. They had always been there. I just hadn't been able to see them. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. It's done. Call me when you're ready. I put the phone in my pocket. I wasn't ready yet. There was still so much to do. The fallout, the lawsuits, the years of work that lay ahead. But for now, for this moment, I let myself breathe. I let myself feel the weight of what I had done. I let myself be. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I was not invisible. I was not dismissed. I was not the sister who was never enough. I was Elena Chin, the woman who had built something extraordinary. The woman who had finally, after 32 years, been seen. The hours after the launch were a blur of ringing phones, flashing notifications, and the relentless, consuming chaos of a story that had exploded beyond anyone's control. I had turned my phone off immediately after leaving the Palace Hotel, not because I was afraid, but because I needed silence. I needed to hear myself think. I needed to feel the weight of what I had done before the world started telling me what it meant. I walked through the streets of San Francisco for hours, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement, the cool night air clearing my head. I walked until my feet ached, until the adrenaline faded and the exhaustion set in. And then, finally, I went home. My apartment was dark, quiet, the city spread out below me like a living map of everything that was about to happen. I poured myself a glass of wine, the same wine I had poured on the night I received Marcus's launch email, and I sat down at my desk. I turned on my phone. The notifications were overwhelming. Hundreds of texts, emails, missed calls. I scrolled through them slowly, not reading, just letting the names wash over me. Former colleagues, old classmates, distant relatives who had never called before. They had all seen the news. They all wanted to know if it was true. They all wanted a piece of the story. I ignored them. There was only one call I was waiting for. It came at 2 a.m. My mother's face appeared on the screen, her name flashing with the insistence of a woman who had been calling for hours. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. And then I answered. Elena. Her voice was sharp, angry, the voice of a woman who had spent her life protecting her son and was now facing the possibility that he was not the person she had always believed him to be. What have you done? I sat in the dark, the phone pressed to my ear, the city lights flickering through my window. I thought about all the times my mother had called me with news about Marcus. His graduation. His first job. His engagement. Each time, she had called with the same bright, cheerful voice, expecting me to be happy for him, to celebrate his success, to pretend that I didn't notice the way she lit up when she talked about him and went quiet when she talked about me. I didn't do anything, Mom, I said. I just told the truth. The truth? Her voice was incredulous, almost hysterical. You destroyed your brother's company. You humiliated him in front of the entire world. You called him a thief. On the night of his greatest achievement. How can you call that the truth? I closed my eyes. I had known this call was coming. I had known that my mother would not see what Marcus had done, that she would not understand why I had done what I did. She had spent 30 years protecting him, defending him, believing in him. She was not going to stop now. The truth is that Marcus stole my work, I said. The code he presented tonight was mine. The algorithms, the architecture, the years of development, all of it was mine. He took it from me, and he claimed it as his own. That's the truth, Mom. Whether you want to believe it or not. There was a long silence. I could hear my mother breathing, the ragged inhale and exhale of a woman who was struggling to hold on to a reality that was crumbling around her. He wouldn't do that, she said finally. Her voice was smaller now, less certain. He wouldn't steal from you. He's your brother. He loves you. I thought about the night Marcus had taken my files. I thought about the way he had smiled at me across the Thanksgiving table, telling me he was proud of me, while he was already planning to take everything I had built. I thought about the years of his life that had been built on my work, my sacrifice, my silence. He took my laptop while I was making coffee, I said. He copied my files, and he never looked back. He spent the next 8 months building a company on the foundation of my work. And he never once, not once, mentioned my name. My mother was quiet. I could hear her thinking, processing, trying to find a way to make this fit into the story she had been telling herself about her children for 3 decades. Why didn't you say something? She asked. Why didn't you tell us? I laughed. It was a hollow sound, empty of humor. When, Mom? When would I have told you? At Thanksgiving, when you spent the whole night fussing over Marcus and didn't ask me a single question about my work. At Christmas, when you gave him a new car and gave me a gift card. At every family dinner, every holiday, every moment of my life, when you looked at me and saw nothing, and looked at him and saw everything. She was crying now. I could hear it in her voice, the tears she was trying to hide. That's not fair, Elena. That's not fair. Fair, I said. You want to talk about fair? Fair is the 3 years I spent in a basement, writing code while Marcus slept. Fair is the investors who turned me down because I didn't have the right connections, the right name, the right face. Fair as watching my brother stand on a stage and take credit for work he didn't do, while the world applauded. That's fair, Mom. That's the truth. I hung up before she could respond. I sat in the dark, the phone in my hand, the city still humming below me. I was shaking, I realized. Not from fear, not from anger, but from something else. Something that might have been release. I thought about my mother. About the woman who had spent her life protecting her son, believing in him, loving him in a way she had never loved me. I thought about the phone call she would make next, to Marcus, to the lawyers, to anyone who could help her put the pieces back together. I thought about the years that lay ahead, the years of silence, the years of distance, the years of being the daughter who had destroyed her brother's life. And I thought about myself, about the woman I had become, about the choices I had made, about the life I was going to build now that the truth was out. I turned my phone off and went to bed. I slept for 12 hours, the deep, dreamless sleep of a woman who had finally, after 3 decades, put down a weight she had been carrying her whole life. When I woke, the world was different. My phone was flooded with messages, the story of the launch having spread overnight to every corner of the tech world. The headlines were brutal. Nexus AI founder accused of stealing code from sister. The fall of Silicon Valley's golden boy. Tech prodigy or fraud? The truth about Marcus Chin. I read them with a detachment that surprised me, as if I were watching a story about someone else, someone I didn't know. But the story was about me. And it was only beginning. Sarah called at noon. Her voice was tired but triumphant, the voice of a journalist who had broken the story of the year. It's everywhere, she said. The Times, the Journal, every tech blog from here to Tokyo. Marcus's lawyers are already spinning, but the evidence is too strong. He's finished. I sat at my window, watching the city move below me. It's not over, I said. The investors are going to fight. They're going to try to salvage something. And Marcus is going to deny everything. He's going to say I'm jealous, that I'm trying to destroy him, that the work was his all along. He can deny all he wants, Sarah said. The evidence is irrefutable. The timestamps, the emails, the photographs. He can't spin his way out of this. I was quiet for a moment. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the truth was enough, that the evidence was enough, that the world would see Marcus for who he was and give me what I deserved. But I had spent too long in the shadows of his success to be naive. The truth isn't always enough, I said. Marcus has been lying his whole life. He's good at it. He's had practice. Sarah was quiet. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more careful. What are you going to do now? I looked out at the city, at the buildings that held the dreams of 1,000 entrepreneurs, 1,000 visionaries, 1,000 people who had risked everything to build something new. I had built something too. Something that Marcus had taken from me. But I was not going to let him keep it. I'm going to build something better, I said. I'm going to take everything I learned from the work he stole, and I'm going to make it better. Faster. Stronger. And when I'm done, I'm going to show the world what I can do. Not as Marcus's sister. Not as the woman who destroyed her brother's company. As Elena Chen. The woman who built something extraordinary. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, there was something in her voice I hadn't heard before. Respect. I'd like to be there when you do, she said. When you're ready to tell your story. The real story. Not the one about what Marcus did, but the one about what you built. What you're going to build. I smiled. It was a small smile, not the triumphant smile of a woman who had won, but the quiet smile of a woman who is just beginning. I'll call you, I said. When it's ready. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my apartment, the city spread out below me, the future stretched out ahead. I had spent my whole life waiting for someone to see me. My parents, my brother, the investors who had turned me down. I had waited for the world to recognize my work, to give me the credit I deserved, to finally, after all these years, let me step into the light. But I was done waiting. I was done letting other people define my worth. I was done being invisible. I opened my laptop and pulled up the files for the new project. The one I had been building in secret, the one that was better than anything Marcus had stolen. It was still rough, still incomplete, still months away from being ready. But it was mine. Every line of code, every algorithm, every breakthrough. Mine. I started to work. Not because I had to, not because I was running from something, but because I wanted to. Because building was what I did. Because the work was the only thing that had ever made sense. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. Marcus's lawyers fought back, filing lawsuits, issuing denials, trying to spin the story in his favor. My parents called every day, alternating between anger and pleading, trying to get me to drop the case, to forgive my brother, to let the past be the past. The tech world, which had celebrated Marcus's rise, was now watching his fall with a hunger that was almost obscene. Every detail of our family's dysfunction was dissected, analyzed, turned into content for a public that couldn't get enough of the story. But through it all, I kept working. I woke early, before the city woke up, and I coded until the sun set. I built. I refined. I created. And slowly, almost without noticing, I began to heal. The breakthrough came on a Thursday, 3 months after the launch. I had been working on a problem for weeks, a piece of the architecture that had been eluding me, a bottleneck that I couldn't seem to break. I was sitting in my apartment, the city dark outside my window, when the solution came to me. Not in a flash of inspiration, but in the quiet certainty of a mind that had been working on a problem for so long that the answer had become inevitable. I wrote the code in an hour. When I was done, I sat back and looked at it, at the elegant simplicity of the solution, at the way it made everything else fall into place. It was better than anything I had built before. Better than anything Marcus had stolen. It was the work of a woman who had spent her life being invisible and had finally learned to see herself. I called Sarah the next morning. "I'm ready," I said. "It's time to tell my story." She was at my apartment within the hour, her laptop open, her voice recorder running. I told her everything. Not just about Marcus, not just about the theft, but about the years of invisibility. About the childhood spent in the shadow of her brother's success. About the parents who saw only one child. About the work that had been her only companion, her only solace, her only proof that she existed. I told her about the night I had written the first line of code for the original project, the excitement I had felt, the hope that this time, maybe, things would be different. I told her about the years of work, the breakthroughs and the failures, the moments of despair and the moments of triumph. I told her about the Thanksgiving dinner where Marcus had smiled at me and told me he was proud of me, while he was already planning to take everything I had built. And I told her about the new project. The one I had been building in secret. The one that was better than anything Marcus had stolen. The one that was going to change everything. Sarah listened without interrupting, her face impassive, her eyes sharp. When I was done, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled. "This is going to be a hell of a story," she said. It was. The piece ran the following week, a long-form feature that traced the arc of my life, my work, my brother's betrayal. It was not the story of a woman who had been wronged. It was the story of a woman who had been invisible and who had finally, after years of being unseen, stepped into the light. The response was overwhelming. Not just from the tech world, which had been following the Marcus Chin story for months, but from people all over the country who saw themselves in my story. Women who had been dismissed, overlooked, told that their work wasn't enough. People who had been told that their dreams were too big, their ambitions too high, their voices too quiet. They wrote to me in the thousands, emails and letters and messages, telling me that my story was their story, that my fight was their fight, that my work had given them hope. I read every message. I answered as many as I could. And with each reply, I felt myself becoming something I had never been before. Not invisible. Not dismissed. Not the sister who was never enough. I was Elena Chin. The woman who had built something extraordinary. The woman who had finally, after 32 years, been seen. The months that followed the publication of Sarah's article were unlike anything I had experienced in my life. I had spent 32 years in the shadows, watching my brother absorb the light that should have been mine, learning to be content with the small satisfactions of work done well and recognition withheld. But now, suddenly, the light was on me. And it was blinding. The interviews came first. Sarah's article had been picked up by every major tech publication, then by the mainstream press, then by outlets around the world. I was asked to speak on podcasts, to appear on panels, to give keynote addresses at conferences I had once attended as a nameless attendee, invisible in the back of the room. I said yes to some and no to most, choosing carefully, guarding my time and my energy with a ferocity that surprised even me. I had spent too long being invisible to let visibility consume me. The offers came next. Venture capitalists who had turned me down years ago were suddenly desperate to invest in my new project. Tech companies that had never heard my name were offering me positions, partnerships, acquisitions. I received emails from the CEOs of companies I had only read about, men and women who had built empires and were now offering me a place in them. I read every offer, considered each one carefully, and declined them all. I was not going to let anyone else own what I was building. Not this time. But the most surprising response came from people I had never met. Women, mostly, but men too. People who had read my story and seen themselves in it. They wrote to me about their own brothers, their own parents, their own work that had been dismissed, overlooked, stolen. They wrote to me about the years they had spent in the shadows, waiting to be seen. They wrote to me about the hope my story had given them, the permission to fight for what was theirs. I read every message. I answered as many as I could. And with each reply, I felt something I had never felt before. Purpose. Not the purpose of building something for myself, but the purpose of building something for others. A way to use what I had learned, what I had built, what I had become, to help the people who were still invisible, still waiting, still hoping to be seen. I thought about the young woman who had written to me about her brother, who had taken credit for her work on a project they had developed together. I thought about the man who had written about his father, who had dismissed his career in the arts as a waste of time, while celebrating his brother's career in finance. I thought about the teenager who had written about her science fair project, which her teacher had submitted under her own name, claiming it as her own. I thought about all the people who had been told that their work wasn't enough, their dreams too big, their voices too quiet. And I thought about what I could do to help them. I started small. A mentorship program for young women in tech, matching experienced professionals with students and early career developers who needed guidance, support, and someone to tell them that their work mattered. I reached out to the women who had written to me, the ones who had shared their stories, and I asked them to help. They said yes, almost all of them, eager to give back, to pay forward the hope they had found in my story. The program grew quickly. Within months, we had hundreds of participants, women from all over the country who were building extraordinary things and needed someone to believe in them. I spoke at their events, reviewed their code, connected them with investors and mentors who could help them take the next step. I watched them grow, watched them succeed, watched them step into the light that had been denied them for so long. And with each success, I felt myself healing. Not from the betrayal, that wound was still there, still tender, still capable of hurting, but from the years of invisibility. The years of being the one who worked while others took credit. The years of being the sister who was never enough. But while I was building something new, the wreckage of the old was still being cleared. Marcus's company, Nexus AI, had collapsed in the weeks after the launch. The investors pulled out, the partners dissolved their agreements, the employees who had believed in his vision scattered to other startups, other opportunities, other dreams. The technology that had been presented with such fanfare was revealed to be what it was, not the work of a genius, but the stolen work of a sister who had been invisible for too long. Marcus himself had disappeared. After the launch, after the story broke, after the world learned what he had done, he had gone to ground. I heard from friends that he had moved back into our parents' house, that he was refusing to leave his room, that he was barely eating, barely speaking. I heard from my mother, in the rare calls she still made, that he was struggling, that he needed time, that he wasn't himself. I listened to her words, the same words she had used to defend him his whole life, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, not the desperate need for her approval that had consumed me for so long. Just a quiet, settled distance. The distance of a woman who had finally, after 32 years, stopped waiting for her mother to see her. My father called me once, in those early months. His voice was gruff, awkward, the voice of a man who had never known how to talk to his daughter and was not about to learn now. "Your mother tells me you're doing well," he said. "The program. The mentorship. It's impressive." I sat in my office, the city spread out below me, the phone pressed to my ear. I thought about all the times I had wanted to hear those words. The science fairs he had missed. The coding competitions he had dismissed. The graduation he had attended only because my mother made him. The years of silence, of distance, of the quiet, persistent message that my work didn't matter, that I didn't matter. "I'm doing what I've always done," I said. "Building things." He was quiet for a moment. I could hear him breathing, the slow, steady rhythm of a man who is trying to find the right words and failing. "Your brother is not well," he said finally. "He needs help. He needs his family." I closed my eyes. I thought about Marcus, hiding in our parents' house, waiting for the world to forget what he had done. I thought about the years he had spent taking what was mine, building his life on the foundation of my work, never once looking back. I thought about the brother I had loved, once, before I understood what love meant to him. "He made his choices," I said. "He's going to have to live with them." "He's your brother," my father said, and there was something in his voice that I had never heard before. Desperation. "He's family." I opened my eyes. The city was still there, still bright, still humming with the energy of a million lives being lived. Somewhere out there, my brother was hiding from the truth. Somewhere out there, my parents were trying to put the pieces back together. And somewhere out there, I was building something new. "I know," I said, "but I'm not the one who broke him. I just told the truth." My father was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Softer. Almost gentle. "I know," he said. "I know you did." He hung up before I could respond. I sat in my office, the phone in my hand, the city lights flickering through my window. I thought about my father, the man who had never known how to love me, who had never seen me, who had spent his life building walls instead of bridges. And for the first time, I felt something other than the cold distance I had built to protect myself. I felt pity. Not for him, not for the father who had failed me, but for the man who had spent his life hiding from the truth and was only now, at the end of everything, beginning to see it. I put the phone down and went back to work. The new project was progressing faster than I had expected. With the distraction of Marcus's launch behind me, with the weight of the truth finally lifted, I found myself working with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The code flowed easily, the architecture coming together in ways that surprised even me. I was building something better than what Marcus had stolen. Something that was not just an evolution of the old work, but a revolution. Something that would change the way people thought about artificial intelligence, about what it could do, about what it should be. I worked through the nights, through the weekends, through the holidays that I spent alone, deliberately, choosing solitude over the hollow performances of family gatherings. I worked through the exhaustion, through the doubt, through the moments when the old voices came back, the ones that told me I wasn't good enough, that my work didn't matter, that I would always be invisible. And slowly, almost without noticing, I began to see what I was building. Not just a piece of software, not just a company, but a future. A future that was mine. The breakthrough came on a night in late autumn. I was sitting in my apartment, the city dark outside my window, when I finished the final piece of the core architecture. I sat back, my hands trembling, my eyes burning, and I looked at what I had built. It was beautiful. It was elegant. It was the work of a woman who had spent her life being invisible and had finally, after all these years, learned to see herself. I called Sarah the next morning. "It's ready," I said. "The project. It's ready to launch." She was at my apartment within the hour, her laptop open, her voice recorder running. I walked her through the code, the architecture, the breakthroughs that made this work different from anything I had built before. I showed her the applications, the possibilities, the future that was waiting to be built. And when I was done, she looked at me with something I had never seen in her eyes before. This is going to change everything," she said. I smiled. It was a small smile, not the triumphant smile of a woman who had won, but the quiet smile of a woman who was just beginning. "I know," I said. The launch was different this time. There was no stage, no crowd, no brother waiting to take credit for my work. There was just me, a website, and a press release that I sent to Sarah and a handful of other journalists who had followed my story. I didn't want the spectacle of the Palace Hotel. I didn't want the cameras, the applause, the performance of success. I wanted the work. I wanted the people who would use it, who would build on it, who would make it something more than I could imagine. The response was immediate. Within hours, the tech world was buzzing about the new platform, the new architecture, the new vision of artificial intelligence that was being offered to the world. The reviews were glowing, the interest intense, the offers pouring in. But this time, I was ready. I had a plan, a vision, a future that was mine. I called Diane, my lawyer, and told her it was time. I want to buy Nexus AI, I said. The remains of it. The patents, the trademarks, the code that Marcus stole. I want it all. She was quiet for a moment. Why? She asked. You have something better. Something that makes his work look like a prototype. I looked out the window, at the city that had been my home for 6 years, at the buildings that held the dreams of 1,000 entrepreneurs, 1,000 visionaries, 1,000 people who had risked everything to build something new. Because it's mine, I said. Because he took it from me, and I want it back. Because I want to build something with it. Something that honors the work I did, the years I spent, the woman I was before I learned to fight. Diane was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Softer. I'll make the calls, she said. I'll see what we can do. The negotiation took months. Marcus's investors, who had lost millions when the company collapsed, were desperate to salvage something from the wreckage. They had no love for Marcus, no loyalty to his vision, no reason to hold on to the scraps of a failed startup. They wanted to sell. The question was the price. Diane negotiated hard. She knew what I wanted, what I was willing to pay, what the technology was worth. She also knew that I had something they wanted, the new platform, the better architecture, the future that was waiting to be built. In the end, they agreed to a price that was a fraction of what they had invested, a pittance compared to what Marcus had promised them. I bought Nexus AI for pennies on the dollar. The company that my brother had built on my work, that had been valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, was mine for less than the cost of a house in the city where I lived. I signed the papers in Diane's office on a cold December morning. The sky was gray, the city shrouded in fog, the world quiet and still. I looked at the documents, at the name that had been Marcus's and was now mine, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph. Not revenge. Something quieter. Something that might have been peace. I called my father that night. He answered on the first ring, his voice wary, as if he had been expecting this call for months. I bought the company, I said. Nexus AI. It's mine now. He was quiet for a long moment. I could hear him breathing, the slow, steady rhythm of a man who was trying to find the right words and failing. What are you going to do with it? He asked finally. I looked out the window, at the city lights flickering in the fog, at the future that was waiting to be built. I'm going to build something, I said. Something that honors the work I did. Something that helps the people who are still invisible. Something that makes the world better than I found it. He was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice was different. Softer. Almost gentle. Your mother would be proud, he said. I'm proud. I closed my eyes. I had waited my whole life to hear those words. And now that they were here, they felt like nothing. Like air. Like the echo of a conversation that should have happened 1,000 times, 1,000 ways, and never did. I know, I said. I know you are. I hung up before he could say anything else. I sat in my office, the city spread out below me, the future stretched out ahead. I had spent my whole life waiting for someone to see me. My parents, my brother, the investors who had turned me down. I had waited for the world to recognize my work, to give me the credit I deserved, to finally, after all these years, let me step into the light. But I was done waiting. I was done letting other people define my worth. I was done being invisible. I opened my laptop and pulled up the files for the new project. The one I had built in secret, the one that was better than anything Marcus had stolen. It was ready now. It was time to share it with the world. I wrote a post on the company blog, a short piece about what I had built, why I had built it, what I hoped it would become. I wrote about the years of work, the failures and the breakthroughs, the moments of despair and the moments of triumph. I wrote about the sister who had been invisible, the brother who had taken what was hers, the family that had never seen her. And I wrote about the future. The one I was building, not for myself, but for everyone who had ever been told that their work didn't matter, their dreams too big, their voices too quiet. When I was done, I sat back and read what I had written. It was the truth. The whole truth. The truth that I had been hiding for my whole life. And for the first time, I was not afraid of what it would cost me. I hit publish. The morning after I published the blog post, I woke to a world that had shifted on its axis. My phone, which I had silenced before going to bed, was a relentless cascade of notifications, hundreds of emails, thousands of social media mentions, calls from numbers I didn't recognize and some that I did. I sat up in bed, the early light filtering through my windows, and I let myself feel the weight of what I had done. I had told the truth. Not the careful, edited truth of Sarah's article, not the truth that was filtered through the lens of journalism and public relations. My truth. The raw, unvarnished, unfiltered story of who I was and what I had built and what had been taken from me. I scrolled through the responses slowly, not reading the words so much as absorbing the energy of them. There was anger, of course. There were always people who would defend the status quo, who would see a woman telling her truth as an attack on a man who had done nothing but take what was offered. There were the predictable comments about family loyalty and airing dirty laundry, and why couldn't she just let it go? I read them with a detachment that surprised me, the words sliding off me like water off stone. I had spent my whole life being dismissed, being told that my feelings didn't matter, that my work wasn't enough. A few anonymous comments on the internet were not going to wound me now. But there was something else too. Something I hadn't expected. There were messages from women who had read my words and seen their own lives reflected back at them. Women who had been erased by brothers, by fathers, by husbands. Women who had watched their work be claimed by others, their achievements dismissed, their existence reduced to footnotes in someone else's story. They wrote to me with a rawness that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. They told me about the code that had been stolen, the patents that had been filed in someone else's name, the credit that had been given to men who had done nothing but show up. They told me about the years they had spent being invisible, and they thanked me for making them feel seen. I spent the morning answering as many as I could, typing until my fingers ached, until the words blurred on the screen. I told them that I saw them, that their work mattered, that they were not invisible. And with each reply, I felt something shifting inside me. The anger that had been my companion for so long was fading, replaced by something else. Something that might have been purpose. The calls started coming in the afternoon. The first was from Diane, my lawyer, her voice brisk and businesslike. The post is getting traction. More than traction. It's everywhere. I've had 3 calls this morning from venture capital firms who want to discuss funding for your new platform. 2 from companies interested in acquisition. And 1 from a journalist who wants to do a profile on you for a major magazine. I sat at my desk, the city spread out below me, the future stretching out ahead. What do you think? I asked. I think you need to be careful, she said. You have something valuable. Something that people are going to want to own. You need to decide what you want to do with it. I looked at the screen of my laptop, at the open window of my code editor, at the work that had consumed me for months. I thought about the offers I had already received, the money that was being waved in front of me, the promise of a future that was someone else's vision, someone else's dream. And I thought about the women who had written to me that morning, the ones who had told me that my story had given them hope, that my work had made them feel seen. I want to build something, I said. Something that lasts. Something that helps the people who are still invisible. I don't want to sell. I want to grow. On my terms. Diane was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Softer. Then that's what we'll do. The next call was from my mother. I let it ring twice, 3 times 4, before I answered. Her voice was strained, the voice of a woman who had spent months trying to hold together something that was already shattered. Elena, she said. I read your post. I waited. There was a long silence, the kind of silence that had filled the space between us for as long as I could remember. It was very honest, she said finally. Perhaps too honest. People are talking. Your father is upset. Marcus, I don't want to talk about Marcus, I said. I've spent my whole life talking about Marcus. I've spent my whole life being invisible while everyone talked about Marcus. I'm done. My mother was quiet. I could hear her breathing, the slow, ragged inhale and exhale of a woman who was losing her grip on the story she had been telling herself for 30 years. He's your brother, she said, and there was something in her voice that I had never heard before. Desperation. He's family. He's a thief, I said. He took my work. He built his life on my work. He stood on a stage and claimed credit for something he didn't do. And you watched. You all watched. And you never said a word. The silence that followed was absolute. I could feel the weight of it, the years of it, the decades of pretending that I didn't matter, that my work didn't matter, that my existence was just a backdrop to my brother's life. I didn't know, my mother said finally, and her voice was small, smaller than I had ever heard it. I didn't know what he had done. I closed my eyes. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the woman who had raised me, who had fed me and clothed me and driven me to school, had not known that her son was stealing from her daughter. But I had spent too long in the shadows of his success to be naive. You knew, I said. You always knew. You knew that he was taking credit for things he didn't do. You knew that he was lying about his achievements, his work, his life. You knew, and you looked the other way. Because it was easier to believe in him than to see me. My mother was crying now. I could hear it in her voice, the tears she was trying to hide. I'm sorry, she said. I'm so sorry. I opened my eyes. The city was still there, still bright, still humming with the energy of a million lives being lived. Somewhere out there, my brother was hiding from the truth. Somewhere out there, my father was trying to put the pieces back together. And somewhere out there, my mother was crying, finally, after all these years, for the daughter she had never seen. I know, I said. I know you are. I hung up before she could say anything else. I sat in my office, the phone in my hand, the city spread out below me. I was crying too, I realized. Not from sadness, not from anger, but from something else. Something that might have been release. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings and calls, of investors and partners, of decisions that would shape the future of what I was building. I turned down the acquisition offers, all of them, even the ones that would have made me rich beyond anything I had ever imagined. I took funding from a small group of investors who believed in my vision, who understood that I was not building a company to sell, but a company to last. I hired a team, not the flashy executives that the venture capitalists wanted me to hire, but the quiet, brilliant engineers who had been working in obscurity for years, whose work had been dismissed, overlooked, stolen. I built a culture that was the opposite of the one Marcus had built. A culture of credit where credit was due, of recognition for the people who did the work, of visibility for the women and men who had spent their lives in the shadows. And I worked. I worked like I had never worked before, pouring everything I had into the platform that was going to change the world. I wrote code in the early mornings, before the rest of the city woke up. I reviewed the work of my team in the afternoons, pushing them to be better, to think bigger, to see what was possible. I worked through the evenings, through the nights, through the weekends that I spent alone, deliberately, choosing solitude over the hollow performances of a life I had left behind. The platform launched 6 months later. It was not the flashy launch of Marcus's startup, not the stage and the lights and the crowd of investors waiting to be impressed. It was a quiet launch, a soft launch, the kind of launch that lets the work speak for itself. I sent an email to the people who had been following my story, the women who had written to me, the investors who had believed in me, the journalists who had told my truth. I invited them to use the platform, to break it, to build on it, to make it something more than I could imagine. The response was immediate. Within days, the platform was being used by developers all over the world, people who had been waiting for something like this, something that was open, accessible, built for the people who would use it, not for the investors who would profit from it. The reviews were glowing, the adoption rapid, the impact undeniable. I had built something that mattered. Something that was changing the way people thought about artificial intelligence, about what it could do, about what it should be. And in the middle of it all, I received a message from Marcus. It came through the contact form on my company's website, a long, rambling email that was part apology and part explanation and part something I couldn't name. He wrote about the years of pressure, the expectations, the desperate need to be seen, to be recognized, to be the person everyone believed he was. He wrote about the night he had copied my files, the shame he had felt, the fear that had driven him. He wrote about the months of pretending, the days when he had looked in the mirror and not recognized the man he had become. He wrote about the collapse, the hiding, the long, slow realization that he had lost everything that mattered. He wrote that he was sorry, that he had always been sorry, that he had spent his whole life running from the truth and was only now, at the end of everything, beginning to see it. I read the email 3 times. The first time, I felt nothing. Just the cold, hollow emptiness that had been my companion for so long. The second time, I felt anger. Hot, burning anger at the brother who had taken everything from me and was now asking for forgiveness he didn't deserve. The third time, I felt something else. Something I hadn't expected. Pity. I wrote back that night. It was a short email, not the long, angry letter I had imagined writing 1,000 times, but something simpler. Something that was for me, not for him. Marcus, I got your email. I read it. I believe that you're sorry. I believe that you've been running from the truth for a long time. I believe that you're only now beginning to see who you are and what you've done. But sorry isn't enough. It's never been enough. You took something from me that I can never get back. The years, the work, the dreams. You took them and you claimed them as your own. And you did it because you thought I wouldn't fight back. Because you thought I was invisible. I'm not invisible anymore. I was never invisible. You just couldn't see me. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you. But I know that I'm not going to spend the rest of my life carrying the weight of what you did. I'm not going to let your choices define me. I'm not going to be the woman who was wronged. I'm going to be the woman who built something extraordinary. I hope you find your way, Marcus. I hope you become the person you were always pretending to be. But I can't help you. I have to build my own life now. Elena, I sent the email and closed my laptop. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, at the lights that flickered in the darkness, at the future that was waiting to be built. I had spent my whole life waiting for my brother to see me, to acknowledge me, to give me the credit I deserved. But I was done waiting. I was done letting other people define my worth. I was done being invisible. I was Elena Chen, the woman who had built something extraordinary. The woman who had finally, after 32 years, stepped into the light. The year after the launch of my platform was the most demanding and the most fulfilling of my life. The company grew faster than I had anticipated, not in the explosive, unsustainable way of the startups that dominated tech headlines, but in the steady, organic way of something built to last. We hired more engineers, opened a second office in New York, expanded our client base to include some of the largest companies in the world. The platform that had started as a project in my apartment was now being used by developers in over 40 countries, powering applications that I could never have imagined when I wrote the first line of code. But the growth brought challenges I hadn't anticipated. There were the inevitable growing pains of a company that was scaling faster than its infrastructure could support, the late-night calls from engineers who had discovered a critical bug, the tense meetings with investors who wanted to know when we would start turning a profit. There were the competitors who had emerged in the wake of my success, companies that had seen what I was building and were trying to build something similar, faster, cheaper. There were the inevitable questions from the press about my feud with Marcus, the endless requests for interviews about the drama that had launched my career, the persistent framing of my success as a story about revenge rather than about the work itself. I navigated it all with a focus that surprised even me. I had spent my whole life being dismissed, being told that I wasn't enough, that my work didn't matter. I was not going to let success do what failure never could. I was not going to let the noise of the world drown out the quiet certainty of my own voice. The mentorship program that had started with a handful of women had grown into something much larger. We now had chapters in 12 cities, partnerships with universities and tech companies, a scholarship fund for young women who wanted to pursue careers in technology. I spoke at conferences and universities, not about my brother or the betrayal, but about the work. About what it meant to build something that mattered. About the importance of credit where credit is due. About the women who had been invisible for too long and were finally, slowly, step by step, stepping into the light. The responses from the women in the program were what sustained me through the hard days. I received letters from young engineers who had gotten their first jobs, their first promotions, their first patents. I received messages from women who had left abusive relationships, who had found the courage to demand credit for their work, who had learned to see themselves the way I had learned to see myself. I received a photograph from a teenager in Detroit who had won her first coding competition, her face split with a grin that made me cry when I saw it. She had written on the back, "For Elena, who showed me that invisible girls can become stars." I framed the photograph and put it on my desk, next to the picture of me at my desk, the one that had been used as evidence in the case against Marcus. Two images, side by side, of a woman who had been invisible and a girl who was learning to be seen. But while I was building something new, the past was not done with me. My parents had been largely silent since my conversation with my mother in the months after the launch. They had not come to the opening of the new office, had not responded to the invitation I sent for the company's first anniversary party. I heard through the family grapevine that they were struggling, that my father had taken a leave from work, that my mother had stopped attending the social events that had once defined her life. They were, I realized, grieving. Not for me, not for the daughter they had lost, but for the son they had believed in. For the story they had told themselves about their family. For the life they had built on the foundation of Marcus's success and were now watching crumble. I felt pity for them, sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night when the city was dark. And the weight of the years pressed down on me. They had not been bad parents, not in the way that word is usually understood. They had fed me, clothed me, sent me to good schools. They had celebrated my achievements in the distracted way of people who were always looking at something else. They had loved me, I believed, in the way they knew how. But their love had always been conditional, contingent on my willingness to be invisible, to let Marcus shine, to accept my place in the shadows. And I had finally, after 32 years, refused. The call from my father came on a Sunday afternoon, when the office was quiet and I was alone in my apartment, reviewing the code for a new feature that was scheduled to launch the following week. His voice was different than I remembered it. Softer. Older. The voice of a man who had been carrying a weight for a long time and was only now beginning to set it down. "Elena," he said. "I've been wanting to call you. For a long time." I didn't know what to say. I sat in my chair, the city spread out below me, the phone pressed to my ear. I thought about all the times I had wanted to hear those words. The science fairs he had missed. The coding competitions he had dismissed. The graduation he had attended only because my mother made him. The years of silence, of distance, of the quiet, persistent message that my work didn't matter, that I didn't matter. "You could start by telling me the truth," I said. "You've never been very good at that." He was quiet for a long moment. I could hear him breathing, the slow, steady rhythm of a man who was trying to find the right words and failing. "I was afraid," he said finally. "I was afraid of what people would think. I was afraid that if I acknowledged what Marcus had done, if I admitted that he wasn't the person I thought he was, then everything I had built would fall apart. My reputation. My life. My family." I closed my eyes. I had known this, on some level, for as long as I could remember. My father's love had always been conditional, contingent on appearances, on the performance of success. He had not been able to see me because seeing me would have meant admitting that his son was not the person he had pretended to be. "And now?" I asked. "Now that it's all fallen apart anyway?" He was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice was different. Smaller. "Now I see," he said. "I see what I did. I see what I allowed to happen. I see the daughter I lost, the daughter I never really knew. And I'm sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry." I opened my eyes. The city was still there, still bright, still humming with the energy of a million lives being lived. Somewhere out there, my father was sitting in his house alone, finally, after all these years, beginning to see the truth. "I'm not asking for your apology," I said. "I'm not asking for anything. I've spent my whole life asking for things that were never going to come. Your approval. Your attention. Your love. I'm done asking." "I know," he said. "I know you are." He hung up before I could say anything else. I sat in my office, the phone in my hand, the city spread out below me. I was not crying, though I had expected to be. I was not angry, though I had carried that anger for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. I was something else. Something I didn't have a name for. Something that might have been peace. The months that followed were a time of consolidation, of building, of growing into the life I had chosen for myself. The company was profitable now, stable, poised for the next phase of growth. The mentorship program was expanding into new cities, new countries, new communities of women who had been invisible for too long. I was speaking less, working more, finding a rhythm that allowed me to do what I did best, build. But there was one piece of the past that I had not yet addressed. One conversation I had been avoiding for months. One person I had not spoken to since the night of the launch. I called Marcus on a Tuesday afternoon, the day before the second anniversary of the launch that had changed everything. He answered on the third ring, his voice wary, the voice of a man who had been expecting this call for a long time. "Elena," he said. "I wasn't sure you would ever call." I sat in my office. The city spread out below me, the phone pressed to my ear. I thought about the brother I had known, the boy who had taken my toys, my friends, my place in the family. I thought about the man who had taken my work, my dreams, my future. I thought about the years of silence, of distance, of the slow, steady erosion of everything I had believed about who I was. "I didn't know if I would either," I said. "But I think it's time." He was quiet for a moment. I could hear him breathing, the quick, shallow inhale and exhale of a man who was afraid of what was coming. "I've been seeing a therapist," he said finally, "for the last year. She's been helping me understand why I did what I did. The pressure. The expectations. The desperate need to be someone I wasn't." I waited. There was more. I could hear it in his voice, the words he had been practicing, the apology he had been rehearsing for months. "I'm sorry, Elena," he said. "I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry for taking your work. I'm sorry for pretending it was mine. I'm sorry for the years I spent pretending to be someone I wasn't, at your expense. I'm sorry for not seeing you. For not being the brother you deserved." I closed my eyes. I had waited my whole life to hear those words. And now that they were here, they felt like nothing. Like air. Like the echo of a conversation that should have happened 1,000 times, 1,000 ways, and never did. "I know," I said. "I know you're sorry." He was quiet. I could hear him waiting, hoping for something more. Forgiveness. Absolution. The chance to start again. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you. You took something from me that I can never get back. The years. The work. The dreams. You took them and you claimed them as your own. And you did it because you thought I wouldn't fight back. Because you thought I was invisible." "I know," he said, and his voice was thick with tears. "I know I did. But I'm not invisible anymore," I said. "I was never invisible. You just couldn't see me." He was crying now, openly, the sound of his sobs filling the space between us. I listened, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not pity. Not anger. Something else. Something that might have been the beginning of letting go. "I'm not going to spend the rest of my life carrying the weight of what you did," I said. "I'm not going to let your choices define me. I'm not going to be the woman who was wronged. I'm going to be the woman who built something extraordinary." "What do you want from me?" he asked. "What can I do?" I opened my eyes. The city was still there, still bright, still humming with the energy of 1,000,000 lives being lived. Somewhere out there, my brother was crying, finally, after all these years, beginning to see what he had done. "I want you to become the person you were pretending to be," I said. "I want you to do the work. To build something of your own. To earn the credit you've been taking for granted your whole life. I want you to see the people who are invisible. To give them the credit they deserve. To be the brother you should have been." "I don't know if I can," he said. "I don't know if I know how." I smiled. It was a small smile, not the triumphant smile of a woman who had won, but the quiet smile of a woman who was finally, after 32 years, letting go. Then learn, I said. That's what I did. I hung up before he could respond. I sat in my office, the phone in my hand, the city spread out below me. I was crying, I realized. Not from sadness, not from anger, but from something else. Something that might have been release. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, at the lights that flickered in the darkness, at the future that was waiting to be built. I had spent my whole life waiting for my brother to see me, to acknowledge me, to give me the credit I deserved. But I was done waiting. I was done letting other people define my worth. I was done being invisible. I was Elena Chin, the woman who had built something extraordinary, the woman who had finally, after 32 years, stepped into the light. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I was not looking back. The third year after the launch was the year everything changed. Not in the explosive, headline-grabbing way of the launch itself, but in the quieter, deeper way of a life that had finally found its footing. The company was stable, profitable, respected. The mentorship program had become a foundation, with a full-time staff, a board of directors, and a reach that extended into dozens of countries. I had learned to delegate, to trust, to let go of the parts of the work that no longer needed my hands. And in the space that opened up, I found something I hadn't known I was looking for. Time. Time to think, to breathe, to be. I started traveling. Not for work, not for conferences or speaking engagements, but for myself. I went to places I had always wanted to see, but had never had the time or the money or the freedom to visit. I walked the streets of Kyoto in the spring, when the cherry blossoms were in bloom and the city was soft with pink and white. I hiked the mountains of Patagonia in the summer, when the air was sharp and the sky was clear and the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. I sat in a cafe in Paris, watching the world go by, drinking coffee that cost more than it should have and tasting like nothing I had ever experienced. I was not running from anything. I was running toward something. Toward a life that was mine. The letters from my father continued. He wrote every week now, the same careful, deliberate hand he had used to sign documents that mattered. But the content had changed. He no longer wrote about Marcus, about the family, about the past. He wrote about the present. The books he was reading, the walks he was taking, the garden he was tending. He wrote about the small things, the ordinary things, the things he had never had time for when he was building his empire. He wrote about the weight of the years, the things he wished he had done differently, the things he was learning now at the end of everything, about what mattered. I read every letter. I kept them in a box under my bed, next to the letters my mother had written before she died. 2 parents, 2 legacies, 2 ways of loving. One had written to prepare me for a future she wouldn't see. The other was writing to understand a past he had spent his life running from. I wrote back sometimes. Not every week. I was still learning to trust, still learning to let go, but often enough. I told him about my travels, my work, my life. I told him about the foundation, the women we were helping, the difference we were making. I told him about the small things, the ordinary things, the things that made me happy. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, when the words came easily, I told him that I loved him, that I was proud of him, that I was glad he was learning to see. The call from my mother came on a Tuesday, 3 years to the day after the launch that had changed everything. I was in my office, the city spread out below me, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. Her voice was different than I remembered it. Softer. Older. The voice of a woman who had been carrying a weight for a long time and was only now beginning to set it down. "Elena," she said. "I've been wanting to call you. For a long time." I didn't know what to say. I sat in my chair, the phone pressed to my ear. I thought about all the times I had wanted to hear those words. The birthdays she had forgotten, the achievements she had dismissed, the years of silence, of distance, of the quiet, persistent message that I didn't matter, that my life was just a backdrop to my brother's. "You could start by telling me the truth," I said. "You've never been very good at that." She was quiet for a long moment. I could hear her breathing, the slow, steady rhythm of a woman who was trying to find the right words and failing. I was afraid, she said finally. I was afraid that if I acknowledged what Marcus had done, if I admitted that he wasn't the person I thought he was, then everything I had built would fall apart. My family, my life, my sense of who I was. I closed my eyes. I had known this, on some level, for as long as I could remember. My mother's love had always been conditional, contingent on the performance of perfection, on the appearance of a family that didn't exist. She had not been able to see me because seeing me would have meant admitting that the son she worshipped was not the person she had pretended he was. And now? I asked. Now that it's all fallen apart anyway? She was quiet again. When she spoke, her voice was different. Smaller. Now I see, she said. I see what I did. I see what I allowed to happen. I see the daughter I lost, the daughter I never really knew. And I'm sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry. I opened my eyes. The city was still there, still bright, still humming with the energy of a million lives being lived. Somewhere out there, my mother was sitting in her house alone, finally, after all these years, beginning to see the truth. I'm not asking for your apology, I said. I'm not asking for anything. I've spent my whole life asking for things that were never going to come. Your approval. Your attention. Your love. I'm done asking. I know, she said. I know you are. She paused, and I could hear her crying, the soft, muffled sobs of a woman who had spent her life holding everything together and was only now allowing herself to fall apart. I've been reading about your work, she said. The foundation. The women you've helped. The difference you're making in the world. I'm proud of you, Elena. I've always been proud of you. I just didn't know how to say it. I sat in my office, the phone pressed to my ear, the city spread out below me. I had waited my whole life to hear those words. And now that they were here, they felt like something. Not the weight I had been carrying, not the emptiness I had learned to live with. Something else. Something that might have been the beginning of healing. I know, I said. I know you are. We talked for a while longer, about nothing and everything, the words flowing more easily than they ever had before. She told me about the garden she had started, the books she was reading, the small, ordinary things that filled her days. I told her about my travels, my work, the life I was building. And when we finally said goodbye, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The months that followed were a time of integration, of bringing together the pieces of a life that had been scattered for too long. I went back to San Jose for the first time in years, to the house where I had grown up, where Marcus had stolen my work, where I had learned to be invisible. The house was smaller than I remembered, the rooms cramped, the walls thin. I stood in the basement where I had written the code that had changed my life, and I felt the weight of the years pressing down on me. The hours, the days, the years of work that had been taken from me. The dreams that had been deferred. The life that had been put on hold. But I was not the same woman who had left this house. I was not invisible. I was not waiting for someone to see me. I was someone who had built something extraordinary. Someone who had helped others build something extraordinary. Someone who had finally, after 32 years, learned to see herself. I walked through the house, touching the walls, the doors, the windows that had framed my childhood. I thought about the girl who had sat in this basement, writing code that no one would see, building something that no one would know was hers. I thought about the years she had spent waiting, hoping, dreaming of a future that seemed impossible. And I thought about the woman she had become. The woman who had fought, who had survived, who had built something that mattered. I stayed in San Jose for a week, visiting the places I had known as a child, the schools, the parks, the libraries where I had spent hours reading about the future I was going to build. I walked the streets of the neighborhood where I had grown up, the houses that had held the lives of families I had known, the corners where I had waited for buses that would take me to places I had only dreamed of. And in the quiet moments, when the city was dark and the only light came from the stars, I let myself remember. The girl who had been invisible. The woman she had become. The life she was building. I visited my parents on the last day of the trip. They were living in a small house in the suburbs, the kind of house they had always looked down on when I was growing up, the kind of house that was meant for people who hadn't made it. The garden was overgrown, the paint peeling, the windows dark. I stood at the door for a long moment, my hand raised to knock, and I felt the weight of the years pressing down on me. My mother opened the door. She looked older than I remembered, smaller, frilier. Her hair was gray now, her face lined with the years, her eyes soft with something I had never seen there before. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she opened her arms. I walked into them. I had spent my whole life waiting for this moment, for the mother who had never seen me to finally, after all these years, hold me. And as I stood in her arms, the years falling away, the weight lifting, I felt something I hadn't felt in as long as I could remember. I felt home. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had eaten breakfast before school, where I had done my homework, where I had listened to my parents talk about Marcus's achievements and my failures. The kitchen was smaller than I remembered, the cabinets faded, the counters worn. But there was something different about it now. Something that might have been peace. My father came in from the garden, his hands dirty, his face lined with the sun. He looked at me, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking at his daughter, the daughter he had never really seen. And then he smiled. "Elena," he said. "You came." I looked at him, at this man who had spent his life building walls, and was only now, at the end of everything, learning to tear them down. "I came," I said. We spent the afternoon together, the three of us, talking about nothing and everything. They told me about the garden, the books, the small, ordinary things that filled their days. I told them about my travels, my work, the life I was building. And when the sun set and the shadows lengthened, I stood up to leave. My mother walked me to the door. She stood in the doorway, the light behind her, her face soft with something I had never seen there before. "Will you come back?" she asked. I looked at her, at this woman who had spent her life loving one child and ignoring the other, and I saw something I had never seen before. I saw a woman who was trying. A woman who was learning. A woman who was, finally, after all these years, beginning to see. "I'll come back," I said. "Not because I've forgiven you. Not because I've forgotten. But because you're my mother. And I want to see who you become." She nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, the gesture of a woman who had spent her life hiding her tears. But this time, she didn't hide. She let me see. And that, more than anything, was a beginning. I drove away from the house, the windows down, the wind in my hair, the stars bright overhead. I thought about the years I had spent running from this place, from the parents who had never seen me, from the brother who had taken everything. I thought about the woman I had been, the woman I was becoming. And I thought about the future I was building, not in spite of them, but because of them. I pulled onto the highway and headed back to the city. The road stretched out before me, empty and dark, the only light coming from the stars and the distant glow of the city I called home. I had spent my whole life running from something. Running from my brother, from my parents, from the truth about who I was and where I came from. But now, for the first time, I was running toward something. Toward a future that was mine. Toward a life that I had built, with my own hands, my own mind, my own relentless, unforgiving determination. I thought about the girl who had sat in the basement, writing code that no one would see. I thought about the woman who had stood on the stage, watching her brother claim her work as his own. I thought about the woman who had fought, who had survived, who had built something extraordinary. And I thought about the woman I was becoming. A woman who was not invisible. A woman who was not waiting. A woman who was finally, after 32 years, living her own life. I drove through the night, the city lights growing brighter, the future growing closer. And when I finally pulled into my parking garage, the engine off, the silence pressing in on me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt peace. The 4th year after the launch was the year I finally stopped running. Not from my family, not from the past, not from the weight of what had been taken from me. I had done that work already. In the long months and years that followed the night I watched my brother's empire crumble. What I stopped running from was myself. The person I had been before the betrayal, before the fight, before the long, grinding years of invisibility. The girl who had sat in a basement writing code because she loved it, because it made her feel alive, because it was the one place in the world where she was completely, utterly herself. I had spent so long being defined by what Marcus had taken from me that I had forgotten who I was before he took it. I was the woman who had built something extraordinary, yes. But I was also the woman who had built something extraordinary because she loved to build. Because the work was the work. Because the act of creation was its own reward. I started spending more time in the code. Not because the company needed me, it didn't, not anymore. I had built a team of brilliant engineers who could run circles around me, who had taken the platform I had built and made it something I could never have imagined. I spent time in the code because I missed it. The quiet focus, the flow state, the satisfaction of solving a problem that had been eluding me for hours, days, weeks. I missed the feeling of my hands on the keyboard, the rhythm of the work, the way the world fell away when I was deep in the architecture. I started a new project. A personal project. Something no one would ever see, something that was just for me. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even Sarah, who had become one of my closest friends in the years since the launch. I worked on it in the early mornings, before the rest of the city woke up. I worked on it late at night, when the office was empty and the only light came from the glow of my screen. I worked on it on weekends, when I should have been resting, when I should have been out living the life I had fought so hard to build. It was not a platform that would change the world. It was not a company that would make me rich. It was something smaller, something simpler. A tool for writers, for artists, for people who were trying to tell their stories and needed help finding the words. I built it slowly, carefully, with the same attention to detail I had brought to the work that Marcus had stolen. I built it because I wanted to, because it made me happy, because it was the first thing I had created in years that was not a response to someone else's betrayal. I finished it on a Sunday afternoon in the spring. The sun was streaming through my windows, the city bright and alive below me. I sat back and looked at the code, at the elegant simplicity of the solution, at the way it all fit together. It was not the most sophisticated thing I had ever built. It was not the most profitable. But it was mine. Completely, utterly, irrevocably mine. I released it for free under an open source license. I didn't announce it, didn't promote it, didn't tell anyone it existed. I just put it out there, into the world, and let it find its own way. Within weeks, it had been downloaded thousands of times. Within months, it had been translated into a dozen languages, adapted for platforms I had never heard of, used by writers and artists and storytellers all over the world. I received emails from people who had used it to write their first novel, their first poem, their first song. I received a letter from a woman in a refugee camp who had used it to document her family's story, to ensure that what they had survived would not be forgotten. I received a photograph from a teenager in a hospital bed, her face lit by the glow of her laptop, the tool I had built open on her screen. I framed the photograph and put it on my desk, next to the picture of the girl from Detroit who had won her first coding competition. 2 images, side by side, of people who had found their voices. People who were no longer invisible. The call from Marcus came on a Wednesday 3 months after I released the tool. I was in my office, reviewing the quarterly reports, when his name appeared on my phone. I hadn't spoken to him since the conversation 2 years ago, the one where I had told him to become the person he was pretending to be. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. And then I answered. "Elena," he said. His voice was different than I remembered it. Calmer. Quieter. The voice of a man who had been doing the work, who had been learning to be still. "Marcus," I said. There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, the slow, steady rhythm of a man who was trying to find the right words. "I've been working on something," he said. "A project. A small one. Nothing like what you've built. But something that's mine." I waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for. An apology? An explanation? A sign that the brother I had loved, once, before I understood what love meant to him, was still somewhere inside the man who had stolen my work? "I wanted to tell you about it," he said. "I wanted you to know that I'm trying. That I'm doing what you said. Building something of my own. Earning the credit." I leaned back in my chair, the city spread out below me, the phone pressed to my ear. I thought about the brother who had taken my toys, my friends, my place in the family. I thought about the man who had taken my work, my dreams, my future. I thought about the years of silence, of distance, of the slow, steady erosion of everything I had believed about who I was. "What are you building?" I asked. He told me. It was a platform for independent artists, a way for them to sell their work without the gatekeepers who had controlled the industry for so long. It was small, simple, built with a care and attention to detail that I hadn't known he possessed. It was not the work of a genius. It was the work of a man who was learning to be ordinary, who was learning to be enough. "It's good," I said when he finished. "It's good work." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I've been seeing a therapist," he said, "for the last 2 years. She's been helping me understand why I did what I did. The pressure, the expectations, the desperate need to be someone I wasn't." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "I know," I said. "I've been doing the same work." There was another pause. I could hear him breathing, the quick, shallow inhale and exhale of a man who was afraid of what was coming next. "I know I can't undo what I did," he said. "I know I can't give you back the years, the work, the dreams. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see what I took. I see what I cost you. And I'm sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry." I closed my eyes. I had waited my whole life to hear those words. And now that they were here, they felt like something. Not the weight I had been carrying, not the emptiness I had learned to live with. Something else. Something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness. "I know," I said. "I know you're sorry." He was quiet. I could hear him waiting, hoping for something more. Forgiveness. Absolution. The chance to start again. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you. But I know that I'm not going to spend the rest of my life carrying the weight of what you did. I'm not going to let your choices define me. I'm not going to be the woman who was wronged. I'm going to be the woman who built something extraordinary." "I know," he said. "I know you are." We talked for a while longer, about his work, about mine, about the small, ordinary things that filled our days. It was awkward, halting, the conversation of two people who had been strangers for so long they had forgotten how to talk to each other. But it was a beginning. A small, fragile beginning. And that, more than anything, was enough. When we hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, the city spread out below me, the phone in my hand. I was not crying, though I had expected to be. I was not angry, though. I had carried that anger for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. I was something else. Something I didn't have a name for. Something that might have been peace. I thought about the brother I had known, the boy who had taken my toys, my friends, my place in the family. I thought about the man who had taken my work, my dreams, my future. I thought about the years of silence, of distance, of the slow, steady erosion of everything I had believed about who I was. And I thought about the man who was trying, now, to build something of his own. To earn the credit he had taken for granted his whole life. To become the person he had been pretending to be. I did not know if he would succeed. I did not know if the years of damage could be undone, if the trust that had been broken could be rebuilt. But I knew that I was not going to be the one who decided. That was his work. His journey. His life. Mine was here. In the company I had built, the foundation I had started, the tool I had released into the world. In the women who were no longer invisible, the stories that were finally being told, the voices that were finally being heard. In the life I was living, not in response to someone else's betrayal, but in pursuit of my own dreams. I stood up and walked to the window. The city was still there, still bright, still humming with the energy of a million lives being lived. Somewhere out there, my brother was building something of his own. Somewhere out there, my parents were learning to see. And somewhere out there, the girl who had sat in a basement writing code was still writing. Still building. Still becoming. I thought about the tool I had released, the one that was helping people tell their stories. I thought about the photograph on my desk, the teenager in the hospital bed, her face lit by the glow of her laptop. I thought about the woman in the refugee camp, documenting her family's story, ensuring that what they had survived would not be forgotten. I thought about all the people who were using what I had built to build something of their own, to tell their stories, to make their voices heard. I smiled. It was a small smile, not the triumphant smile of a woman who had won, but the quiet smile of a woman who was finally, after all these years, at peace. I walked back to my desk and opened my laptop. I had work to do. Not the work of building a company, not the work of fighting a war that was already won. The work of being alive. The work of being present. The work of being Elena. I opened the code for the next version of the tool, the one I had been tinkering with for months, the one that would make it easier, faster, more accessible. I started to write. The words came easily, the code flowing from my fingers like water. I was not writing to prove anything. I was not writing to fight anyone. I was writing because I loved it. Because it made me feel alive. Because it was the one place in the world where I was completely, utterly myself. I wrote until the sun set, until the city lights flickered on, until the only light in my office came from the glow of my screen. And when I finally stopped, I looked at what I had built and I smiled. It was not the most sophisticated thing I had ever built. It was not the most profitable. But it was mine. Completely, utterly, irrevocably mine. I closed my laptop and stood up. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, at the lights that flickered in the darkness, at the future that was waiting to be built. I had spent my whole life running from something. Running from my brother, from my parents, from the truth about who I was and where I came from. But now, for the first time, I was not running. I was standing still. And in that stillness, I found something I had been looking for my whole life. I found myself. The 5th year after the launch was the year I learned to stop measuring my life by what had been taken from me. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, the way the light changes in the evening without you noticing until suddenly the day is gone and the night has come. I had spent so long defining myself against my brother's betrayal, the woman who was wronged, the sister who fought back, the daughter who finally stepped into the light, that I had forgotten there was a woman underneath all of that. A woman who was not defined by what Marcus had done, but by what she had chosen to do with what remained. The foundation had grown into something I could never have imagined when I started it. We now had programs in 23 countries, partnerships with universities and tech companies, a fellowship for young women from underrepresented communities who wanted to pursue careers in technology. We had helped thousands of women find their voices, claim their work, step into the light that had been denied them for so long. I received letters every week from women who had been invisible and were now seen. I kept them in a box under my desk, next to the letters my mother had written before she died. 2 boxes, 2 legacies, 2 ways of making meaning out of the years. The company was thriving, stable, respected. We had expanded into new markets, developed new products, built a team of engineers and designers and executives who were among the best in the world. I had stepped back from day-to-day operations, handing the reins to a CEO I trusted, a woman who had been with me from the early days and who shared my vision for what the company could become. I was still involved, still present, but I was no longer necessary. The company could live without me. And that, more than anything, was proof that I had built something that would last. I spent more time at the foundation now, working directly with the women we were helping. I led workshops, reviewed applications, sat in on interviews. I listened to their stories, the stories of women who had been dismissed, overlooked, erased. I heard echoes of my own voice in their words, the same pain, the same anger, the same desperate hope that someone would finally see them. And I told them what I had learned, that they were not invisible, that their work mattered, that they were enough. I thought about the girl who had sat in a basement writing code that no one would see. I thought about the woman who had watched her brother claim her work as his own. I thought about the years of silence, of distance, of the slow, steady erosion of everything she had believed about who she was. And I thought about the woman she had become. A woman who was not defined by what had been taken from her, but by what she had chosen to build with what remained. The call from my mother came on a Sunday afternoon, when I was in my apartment, reading through the latest letters from the women in our fellowship program. Her voice was different than I remembered it. Calmer. Quieter. The voice of a woman who had been doing the work, who had been learning to be still. "Elena," she said, "I've been thinking about you. About the work you're doing. The foundation. The women you're helping." I sat in my chair, the phone pressed to my ear, the city spread out below me. I thought about all the times I had wanted to hear those words. The years of silence, of distance, of the quiet, persistent message that my work didn't matter, that I didn't matter. I'm proud of you, she said. I know I've said it before, but I want you to know that I mean it. I see what you're doing. I see who you are. And I'm proud. I closed my eyes. I had waited my whole life to hear those words. And now that they were here, they felt like something. Not the weight I had been carrying, not the emptiness I had learned to live with. Something else. Something that might have been the beginning of something new. I know, I said. I know you are. She was quiet for a moment. I could hear her breathing, the slow, steady rhythm of a woman who was learning to be present. Your father is sick, she said finally. The doctors say it's serious. They don't know how much time he has. I opened my eyes. The city was still there, still bright, still humming with the energy of a million lives being lived. Somewhere out there, my father was dying. The man who had built an empire and watched it crumble. The man who had spent his life running from the truth and was only now, at the end of everything, learning to be still. What does he need? I asked. He needs to see you, she said. He needs to tell you something. Something he's been carrying for a long time. I was quiet for a moment. I thought about my father, the man who had never known how to love me, who had never seen me, who had spent his life building walls instead of bridges. I thought about the years of silence, of distance, of the quiet, persistent message that I didn't matter, that my work was just a hobby, that my life was just a backdrop to my brother's. I thought about the letters he had written, the words he had said, the slow, halting progress he had made towards seeing the daughter he had never really known. I'll come, I said. When? She told me the hospital, the room number, the visiting hours. I wrote them down on a piece of paper, though I knew I would remember them. I hung up and sat in my office, the city spread out below me, the paper in my hand. I drove to the hospital the next morning. The sky was gray, the streets empty, the world quiet and still. The hospital was a low-slung building of concrete and glass, the kind of place where people went to die. I walked through the doors, past the reception desk, down the long, white corridors that smelled of antiseptic and fear. I found the room, stood at the door for a moment, my hand raised to knock. And then I walked in. My father was in the bed, small and frail, the machines around him beeping and humming. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, more fragile. The years had carved lines into his face that hadn't been there before, the weight of the past pressing down on him in ways that even I couldn't see. He was sleeping or pretending to sleep, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. I sat in the chair beside the bed and waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for. An apology? An explanation? A sign that the man who had spent his life running from the truth was finally, at the end of everything, ready to stop? His eyes opened after a long moment. He looked at me, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked. And then he smiled. Elena, he said. You came. I looked at him, at this man who had spent his life building walls and was only now, at the end of everything, learning to tear them down. I came, I said. He was quiet for a moment. I could see him gathering his strength, the words he had been carrying for so long finally rising to the surface. I was wrong, he said. About you. About Marcus. About everything. I spent my whole life trying to build something that would last. An empire. A legacy. A family that would be remembered. And I failed. I failed because I didn't see what was right in front of me. I didn't see you. I sat in the chair, the city spread out below me through the window, the machines beeping and humming around us. I thought about all the times I had wanted to hear those words. The science fairs he had missed. The coding competitions he had dismissed. The graduation he had attended only because my mother made him. The years of silence, of distance, of the quiet, persistent message that my work didn't matter, that I didn't matter. I know, I said. I know you didn't. He reached for my hand, his fingers thin and cold, his grip weak. I let him take it. I let him hold on. I see you now, he said. I see the woman you've become. The work you've done. The lives you've changed. And I'm proud, Elena. I'm so proud. I looked at him, at this man who had spent his life running from the truth, and I saw something I had never seen before. I saw a man who was finally, after all these years, standing still. I know, I said. I know you are. He held my hand for a long time, his grip weak, his breathing shallow. We didn't talk. There was nothing left to say. The words had been said, the truth had been told, the years of silence had finally been broken. He died 3 days later. I was there in the room when he took his last breath. My mother was on the other side of the bed, holding his other hand, her face wet with tears. Marcus was in the corner, his face pale, his hands shaking. We sat in silence, the three of us, watching the man who had built an empire and watched it crumble finally, at the end of everything, let go. The funeral was small, the way he had wanted it. A few friends, a few colleagues, the family that was left. I spoke, though I hadn't planned to. I stood at the podium, the words coming from somewhere I didn't know existed, and I told them about the man I had known. The man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had read me stories before bed, who had held my hand at my mother's funeral. The man who had built an empire and watched it crumble. The man who had spent his life running from the truth and was only now, at the end of everything, standing still. I told them about the letters he had written, the words he had said, the slow, halting progress he had made towards seeing the daughter he had never really known. I told them about the last conversation we had, the words he had said, the hand he had held. And I told them that I was proud of him, that I was proud of the man he had become, that I was proud to be his daughter. When I finished, the room was silent. My mother was crying, her face buried in her hands. Marcus was standing in the back, his face wet with tears, his eyes on me. I walked back to my seat and sat down. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. We were both there, in that room, together. And that, more than anything, was enough. After the funeral, I drove back to the city. The sky was clear, the sun bright, the world moving on as it always does. I thought about my father, about the man he had been, about the man he had become. I thought about the letters he had written, the words he had said, the hand he had held. I thought about the years of silence, of distance, of the slow, steady erosion of everything I had believed about who I was. And I thought about the woman I had become. A woman who was not defined by what had been taken from her, but by what she had chosen to build with what remained. I pulled into my parking garage and sat in the car for a long time, the engine off, the silence pressing in on me. I had spent my whole life running from something. Running from my brother, from my parents, from the truth about who I was and where I came from. But now, for the first time, I was not running. I was standing still. And in that stillness, I found something I had been looking for my whole life. I found peace,